Okay. Hi, everybody. This is Nick Rabulis. I'm the editor of Educational Theory. This is another in a series of interviews that we're doing with authors of papers that have been published in the journal. Today's guest is David Carr, who's written an article recently called The Practical Wisdom of Phronesis in the Education of Purported Virtuous Character. We'll come back to that purported word in a second. David, thank you for joining us.
Okay, thank you.
Good. So let's start with this idea of phronesis, this Aristotelian idea. For many people who aren't familiar with the concept, what does it mean? And why do you think there's a sort of a resurgence of interest in this topic now?
Which one of those questions do you want me to answer first?
Let's start with what is it?
What is it? Okay. Well, phronesis, or practical wisdom, is one of several intellectual virtues distinguished in Book 6 of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. These intellectual capacities are concerned with the rational ordering of natural human powers, abilities, faculties, attitudes, and sentiments for various quite diverse human purposes. Before we go any further, it may be appropriate to distance ourselves from a modern association of the term virtue with moral, or with morality. The term arete, translated as virtue, the Greek term, has no distinct association or connection with morality. In fact, it just simply meant good or excellent or even just fit for purpose. It's a functional notion of goodness. And as such, as I say, it has it can be actually inanimate objects could be described as virtuous in the sense of good, useful for a purpose, and so on. So there's no necessary connection with morality. And if I can do a little bit of a plug for myself, in a forthcoming article, by the way, this is one of several articles I've written in recent years, starting with the article I wrote 2 years ago for Educational Theory on Flourishing, one of several articles in which I'm critiquing the recent fad, particularly in philosophy of education and moral education for virtue ethics and for the idea of virtue and so on. In a forthcoming paper in Journal of Moral Education, I make a great play of distinguishing the concerns of the Aristotelian notion of goodness, arete, from any kind of modern moral association. Well, in the first place, then, phronesis is considered by Aristotle to be an intellectual virtue. In the second place, he regards it as a form of practical reasoning. For our present purposes, Aristotle makes quite an important general distinction between theoretical and practical virtues, and I go into this quite a bit in the article. Theoretical virtues, such as episteme, for example, are concerned with the reasoning to truth, reasoning to knowledge and truth. But there are a range of other virtues, such as phronesis, techne, and so on, which are directed towards the pursuit of practical ends. In the case of techne, for example, the concern of techne is the intellectual virtue concerned with the promotion of arts and skills, with the promotion of kinds of practical knowledge, the kind of knowledge that a carpenter or a sculptor might need in order to promote effective carpentry or joinery or sculpture. But Aristotle then distinguished, as we've more or less indicated, distinguishes between diverse sorts of practical reason. Technique, we've just noted. Phronesis, on the other hand, is concerned with the not with the arts and skills of technique, but it's concerned with the ordering of our feelings, passions, and sentiments to the end of positive or beneficial or effective, good, whatever word you want to use, personal and interpersonal agency and conduct, or, as it is commonly said, with the cultivation of virtue or virtuous conduct, and particular virtues like honesty and courage and temperance and justice and so on. But it's important also to note, particularly for the ultimate concerns of my educational theory paper, it's important to note that unlike episteme, or even arguably techne, the practical wisdom of phronesis is not concerned with the discovery of knowledge or truth. Not primarily. It may employ knowledge or truth, may utilize knowledge or truth in order to achieve effective functioning with respect to courage or temperance and so on. But it is not actually itself, it's not appropriate to consider phronesis itself to be a form of knowledge. In fact, Aristotle himself once characterizes phronesis as concerned with deliberation to judgment. And the judgments of so-called virtuous agents can be diverse, can be contradictory in the same circumstances. That's partly, or well, perhaps largely, because many of the circumstances in which we need to make what we've now called today moral judgments are conflicted. They admit of different perspectives and different sorts and different ways of resolving the conflicts. So virtuous agents, two virtuous agents in the same circumstances, in circumstances, say, where there's a conflict between honesty and compassion, may act in quite different ways. Okay, so there can be different manifestations of virtue. Now, okay, do you want me to say something about why is it become so?
That was what I was going to ask you, the second part of that question. Why is there this resurgence of interest in the concept of phronesis, particularly?
Well, I suppose it goes back mainly to the publication by the great British philosopher Elizabeth Anscombe of a paper called Modern Moral Philosophy in the journal Philosophy in 1958. And Anscombe at the time attacked quite vehemently, quite strongly attacked the received ethical theories of her day, mainly Kantianism and utilitarianism. And going back to the point I made about the dissociation, well, the lack of connection between the old Greek term arete and any modern sense of morality, it's that modern sense of morality that Anscombe wanted to get away from. And that's why she reverts to Aristotelian ethics. She wants to go back to Aristotelian ethics because she thinks that a turn to the idea of virtue gets us away from all the problems about all the modern problems about discovering a meaning or a sense to morality that utilitarianism and Kantianism and so on had become embroiled in.
Yeah, I think that's very helpful, and I appreciate the fact that you're pointing to Anscombe's article. I think most people would probably look at Alistair McIntyre's book after Virtue. Maybe fewer people are aware of Anscombe's piece, so it's great that you're drawing our attention to that.
Can I
Go ahead.
can I give myself another plug?
Sure.
I have a paper which is attacking Anscombe's position and her reversion to an Aristotelian naturalism as a basis for ethics in a paper that's published. It's another Wiley paper. It's been published about the same time as the educational theory paper in philosophical investigations. So that for anybody interested in this, that might be worth looking at as well.
That's great. So the bulk of your paper recounts two approaches to educating for phronesis, two different ways we could be pursuing the development of this arete, this skill, this ability in students. And so can you contrast these two approaches, express your concerns about one and why you tend to prefer the other?
Okay. Well, as going back to the Aristotle's initial definition of phronesis as an intellectual virtue, as a strictly intellectual virtue, something close to phronesis, very close to phronesis, if not identical, might well be taught or at least encouraged through fairly uncontroversial, conventional moral education. For example, if the task is to help learners to recognize, appreciate, and reflect upon human moral conflicts and dilemmas, this might well be done in history or literature or civics classes by assisting pupils to appreciate some of the apparent injustices of past forms of political organization and human association. Indeed, since much great past and present day literature, from at least the Greek tragedians onwards, has clearly been devoted to such issues, there's plenty of food for thought in, say, an Austen novel such as Emma, to foster the cultivation of better deliberation and judgment of the kind that Aristotle does associate with phronesis. That said, Aristotle evidently envisages a much more ambitious role for phronesis, which clearly extends beyond any mere intellectual appreciation of moral issues or dilemmas, or for that matter, effective deliberation or judgment on the best solution, or even effective action in the light of such deliberation. For Aristotle, truly phronetic, use the adjective, or more precisely virtuous agents, are not just those who can deliberate to reasonable practical judgments, but those whose effective dimensions of character are ordered in accordance with such deliberations. In fact, here Aristotle clearly distinguishes between the virtuous and the merely continent. Virtuous distinguishes between the virtuous and the merely continent, who, while they may reason as well as, or even better than the virtuous, may yet be enthralled to passions or desires at serious odds with what they clearly discern to be right or good. In this sense, a fully phronetic education would involve the empirical reordering of the effective dimensions of character in some desired direction. So our two conceptions of phronesis are, first, it can be a matter of purely intellectual education and purely intellectual instruction or acquaintance with moral dilemma, appreciation of moral dilemmas, helping pupils to understand what a moral dilemma is, helping them to see various ways in which such moral dilemmas might be addressed. Now, that's not just effective reasoning of that kind would not just be confined to virtuous agents. It would be it might be characteristic of continent agents as well, people who don't feel in the same way that the virtuous agent does, people whose emotions aren't in sync with their reason in these matters. Well, it's this more robust, the more robust sense of education in phronesis is the one to which very many so-called character educationalists in the contemporary scene are drawn. Basically, as I say in the paper, I think the problem with much contemporary, particularly neo-Aristotelian character education, is they want to have their cake and eat it. Past moral education, theories of moral education have tended to as we all remember, there was a long period of theorizing about moral education, which was influenced by the American psychologist Lawrence Kohlberg. And Lawrence Kohlberg, the emphasis in Lawrence Kohlberg is on people thinking in the right sort of way, acquiring the sort of principles and the kind of deliberations which were characteristic of a reasoning moral agent. But opposed to Kohlberg have been the character educationalists who say, well, reasoning is all very well, but we want people to actually do the business. We want people to perform as moral agents. So much American character education reacting to Kohlberg tended to emphasize the, you might even say, the conditioning of pupils in right moral conduct. Okay, what neo-Aristotelian moral educationalists have wanted to, the holy grail of neo-Aristotelian character educationalists is a conception of moral education that in which not just the education of people in principles, in capacities for deliberation and capacities for reasoning is important, but also changing their characters towards desirable moral ends, towards desirable moral conduct, and so on. Now, what I want to argue in the paper is that the first conception, and of course they invoke the idea of phronesis because it seems to be tied into both intellectual deliberation and also tied into the changing of moral conduct. What I attempt to argue in the paper is that while the first educational purpose is legitimate, is perfectly uncontroversial, understanding phronesis as a matter of helping people to understand the moral life, that's all fine, well and good. But if phronesis is also a matter not of knowledge, but of deliberation to judgment, and there can be different kinds of deliberation to judgment, different virtuous agents may be influenced by different feelings as well as by different reasoning, then where we seem to be treading on territory that is not quite so acceptably educational. We're beginning to talk here about changing people's character in a particular sort of direction, which is beginning to look more like indoctrination than education. So the first sense of phronesis as an intellectual virtue, helping people to understand and appreciate moral life, that seems to be a perfectly legitimate educational task, in my view. Going beyond that, to change people in particular sorts of directions, to shape their characters in a particular sort of way, to achieve certain kinds of, well, they would have to be predetermined moral ends, seems to be much more suspect.
David, thank you very much. This is a great summary of the piece. I really want to encourage people. There's much in it that we haven't had a chance to talk about. There's a link to the article here with the video. I encourage people to read the whole thing. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today.
Thank you very much. Is that okay?
Yep, it's great. Outstanding.
Okay.